Some people say that when you lose a parent, their belongings become sacred treasures. For me, that treasure was my mother Sarah's wedding dress, a vintage ivory masterpiece she wore in 1995. I kept it safe in my cedar chest, dreaming of the day I would walk down the aisle wearing her love story. I never imagined my stepmother Diana would destroy it intentionally, then have the audacity to ask for more. But sometimes, life gives you the perfect opportunity for karma to work its magic. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for yourself, and do not forget to subscribe, because today's tale is about learning when to fight fire with fire. Trust me, you will want to hear how this unfolds. Growing up in our cozy suburban home in Denver, Colorado, I always felt the presence of my mother, Sarah, even after she passed away from cancer when I was 16. The house still carried her warmth in every corner, from the lavender she planted in the front garden to the family photos lining the hallway. My father, Marcus, tried his best to keep her memory alive, but 3 years after her death, loneliness got the better of him. That is when Diana entered our lives. At 45, she was polished and confident, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that screamed success. She brought her 15-year-old son, Kyle, with her, a quiet kid who spent most of his time gaming in his room. Diana worked in real estate and made good money, which seemed to impress my father. During their courtship, she was charming and considerate, always asking about my day and complimenting my mother's decorating choices. The wedding dress lived in my bedroom, carefully preserved in a cedar chest that my grandmother had given to my mother. It was a stunning creation of hand-sewn lace and delicate beadwork, with tiny pearls scattered across the bodice like stars. The ivory silk had aged gracefully, maintaining its ethereal glow. My mother used to tell me stories about choosing every detail, from the sweetheart neckline to the cathedral train that had flowed behind her like a river of dreams. Whenever I felt lost or disconnected from her memory, I would open that chest and run my fingers over the fabric. The dress smelled faintly of the jasmine perfume she wore, mixed with the cedar that protected it from time's damage. I had promised myself that when I found the right person, I would honor her by wearing it on my wedding day. It was more than clothing. It was a bridge between us, a way to have her with me during the most important moment of my life. But Diana had different plans for our family's future. Within months of moving in, she began what she called modernizing the house. Family photos of my mother mysteriously disappeared from the living room, replaced by abstract art that Diana claimed was more sophisticated. She redecorated the kitchen painting over the soft yellow walls that my mother had chosen because they reminded her of sunshine. Each change felt like another piece of my mother being erased. When I protested, Diana would smile sweetly and explain that it was time for the family to move forward. She spoke about creating new memories and not living in the past, but her words felt like knives. My father, desperate to keep peace, and perhaps feeling guilty about his new happiness, always sided with her. He would pat my shoulder and say that change was healthy, that my mother would want us to embrace new beginnings. The tension in our house grew thicker each month. Diana never directly confronted me about my attachment to my mother's belongings, but she made subtle comments about how dwelling on loss was unhealthy for a young woman my age. She suggested I should be dating more, focusing on my future instead of clinging to the past. Her words were always wrapped in false concern, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. I felt increasingly isolated in my own home, like a guest who had overstayed their welcome. Kyle kept to himself, probably sensing the undercurrents of conflict. My father seemed oblivious to the psychological warfare happening under his roof. too caught up in his new romance to notice how Diana's presence was suffocating the last remnants of our old family dynamic. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when I was 28 and working as a project coordinator for a property management company downtown. I had left for work early that day, kissing my father goodbye and waving to Diana, who was still in her silk pajamas, claiming she planned to do some spring cleaning on the second floor. Something about her eager expression should have warned me, but I was focused on a presentation I had to give that afternoon. When I returned home around 6:30 that evening, I found Diana in the kitchen, pacing nervously and wringing her hands. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were suspicious dark stains on her white blouse. The moment she saw me, she rushed over with tears in her eyes, grabbing my hands with trembling fingers. She told me there had been a terrible accident while she was organizing the upstairs linen closet. According to her story, she had been carrying a large cup of coffee and had tripped over Kyle's skateboard, which he had carelessly left at the top of the stairs. The coffee had spilled everywhere, including into my bedroom, where my mother's wedding dress had been soaking in the cedar chest I had foolishly left open. My heart stopped beating for several seconds as I processed her words. I ran upstairs, taking the steps, 3 at a time, and burst into my bedroom to find the cedar chest wide open and my mother's dress lying in a puddle of brown liquid. The ivory silk was soaked through and dark stains had spread across the delicate lace like a disease. The smell hit me immediately. Not just coffee, but something sweeter and more artificial. Diana followed me upstairs, continuing her performance of devastation and guilt. She kept apologizing, saying she would pay for professional cleaning, that surely the dress could be saved. But I was not listening to her words. I was staring at the ruins of my most precious possession, feeling like I was losing my mother all over again. The dress that was supposed to connect us on my wedding day was destroyed, and with it, a piece of my soul seemed to die. The next morning, I carefully wrapped the dress in clean towels and began calling every dry cleaner in Denver. The first 2 places I visited took one look at the damage and shook their heads sadly. The third location was run by an elderly man named Giuseppe, who had been in the business for 40 years. He examined the dress under a magnifying glass, his weathered hands gentle as he lifted the fabric. After several minutes of close inspection, Giuseppe looked up at me with knowing eyes. He said this was not coffee damage. The stains were a combination of grape juice and chocolate syrup, applied in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than a random spill. He had seen enough intentional damage over the decades to recognize the signs. Someone had wanted to make sure this dress could never be restored. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Diana had not just destroyed my mother's dress in an accident. She had planned it, calculated it, executed it with precision. The tears she had shed were not from guilt, but from the satisfaction of finally removing the last major symbol of my mother's presence in our home. I thanked Giuseppe for his honesty and drove home in a fog of rage and disbelief. That evening, I confronted Diana in the living room, presenting Giuseppe's professional analysis as evidence of her deception. She listened with wide eyes that gradually narrowed as I spoke. When I finished, she laughed, actually laughed, and said I was clearly having some kind of breakdown. She suggested that my grief over my mother had made me paranoid and unstable, that I was seeing conspiracies where none existed. My father, who had been reading the newspaper in his favorite chair, looked up with concern. But his worry was not for me or the destroyed dress. It was for Diana, who was now crying again and talking about how difficult it had been to live with someone who resented her presence. She painted herself as the victim, trying so hard to be a good stepmother to an ungrateful daughter who blamed her for every misfortune, Marcus believed every word. He told me to stop being dramatic, to stop looking for someone to blame for what was clearly an accident. When I tried to explain Giuseppe's findings, he dismissed them as the opinion of an old man trying to drum up business by creating problems. The betrayal from my father hurt almost as much as losing the dress itself. For 2 weeks, our house existed in a state of Cold War. Diana acted as if nothing had happened, humming while she cooked dinner and chatting cheerfully about her real estate clients. I moved through my days like a ghost, going to work, coming home, and spending my evenings locked in my room, mourning not just the dress, but the family I thought I had. Then Diana made an announcement that changed everything. She had decided to celebrate her 15th wedding anniversary with my father by renewing their vows in an elaborate ceremony. They had booked the Riverside Gardens venue for a Saturday evening in May, complete with dinner for 50 guests and a professional photographer. She wanted everything to be perfect, she said, to show the world how much their love had grown over the years. As she described her plans with glowing enthusiasm, Diana suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine remorse. She said she had just remembered that I might have another dress from my mother's era, something that could work for such a special occasion. She had seen me looking through old photos and recalled a bridesmaid dress my mother had worn to her cousin's wedding in 1994. The dress Diana was referring to was indeed beautiful. Ivory silk with simpler details than the wedding gown, but elegant nonetheless. My mother had looked radiant in the photos, standing beside her cousin with a bouquet of white roses. The dress had been carefully preserved alongside the wedding gown, though it held less emotional significance for me, since it was not from my parents' wedding. Diana approached me with honey in her voice, asking if she could possibly borrow the bridesmaid dress for her vow renewal ceremony. She spoke about wanting to honor my mother's memory by wearing something that had been hers, about how meaningful it would be to have that connection to the family's history. She even offered to have it professionally fitted and promised to take excellent care of it. My first instinct was to refuse immediately. The thought of Diana wearing any of my mother's clothing made my skin crawl, but as I listened to her request, a different kind of calculation began forming in my mind. This was an opportunity, perhaps the only one I would ever get to balance the scales between us. Working in property management had given me connections throughout Denver's event industry. I knew which venues had problems, which caterers cut corners, and which locations tried to hide their maintenance issues from clients. The Riverside Gardens was one of those places I had learned to avoid recommending to my own clients. 3 months earlier, I had fielded multiple complaints from corporate event planners about sewage backups at the venue during large gatherings. The building's plumbing system was outdated, installed in the 1970s, and never properly upgraded, despite the facility's expansion over the years. During events with more than 30 people, the toilets would overflow and wastewater would back up into the main event space. The venue's manager, Patricia, was someone I had worked with on several occasions. She had confided in me about the problem during a particularly stressful week when 2 different clients had threatened lawsuits over ruined events. The venue was trying to manage the issue quietly, scheduling maintenance for after busy periods and hoping they could get through the season without major incidents. Patricia had mentioned that they were planning to renovate the entire plumbing system after summer. But for now, they were just crossing their fingers and offering discounts to keep clients happy. She had specifically warned me not to book any large events there until the repairs were completed, especially evening affairs when the backup risk was highest. As Diana continued her heartfelt plea for the dress, I made my decision. I would agree to lend it to her, but I would conveniently forget to mention what I knew about her chosen venue. After all, she had not bothered to warn me before destroying my mother's wedding dress. Why should I warn her about a little plumbing problem I put on a show of reluctance, sighing deeply and expressing my reservations about lending out my mother's belongings? I mentioned how difficult it was for me to see her things being worn by someone else, how it brought up painful memories. Diana nodded sympathetically, promising again that she would treat the dress like a precious treasure. Finally, I agreed, saying that I supposed my mother would have wanted her belongings to bring joy to others. Diana clasped her hands together in delight, already envisioning how perfect she would look in the vintage silk. She began planning immediately, talking about alterations and accessories, about how romantic it would be to wear something with such history. Over the following weeks, I watched Diana's preparations with quiet satisfaction. She hired expensive vendors, ordered elaborate floral arrangements, and sent out elegant invitations to everyone in their social circle. She bought new jewelry to complement the dress and scheduled multiple hair and makeup trials. This was clearly going to be the event of the year for her, a chance to show off her perfect marriage and impeccable taste. I maintained my helpful facade, even offering suggestions for photographers and musicians when she asked. Inside, I was counting down the days until her beautiful celebration would turn into something she would never forget. Sometimes the universe provides its own justice. You just have to be patient enough to let it unfold. The day of Diana's vow renewal ceremony dawned bright and clear, with temperatures in the mid-70s and a gentle breeze that seemed perfect for an outdoor celebration. I helped her get ready carefully, fastening the tiny buttons on my mother's bridesmaid dress and adjusting the vintage pearl necklace she had chosen to complete the look. She looked genuinely beautiful, her excitement radiating as she admired herself in the full-length mirror. My father was equally enthusiastic, wearing a new charcoal gray suit and beaming with pride as he prepared to publicly recommit to the woman he loved. Kyle had even dressed up for the occasion, looking uncomfortable but handsome in his first real suit. The whole family seemed to glow with anticipation as we prepared to leave for the Riverside Gardens. I had chosen to wear a simple navy dress, playing the role of supportive stepdaughter perfectly. When Diana thanked me again for lending her the dress, I smiled warmly and said I was happy it would be part of such a meaningful celebration. My performance was flawless. She had no idea what was coming. The venue looked spectacular when we arrived at 5:30. Patricia had clearly gone all out to make sure everything appeared perfect, at least initially. White roses and baby's breath decorated every surface, and strings of fairy lights created a magical atmosphere as the sun began to set. 50 guests mingled on the patio, sipping champagne and admiring the elegant setup. Diana was in her element, graciously accepting compliments on her dress in the beautiful venue. She posed for countless photos with my father, both of them looking radiant and deeply happy. The photographer captured every moment, from the intimate glances they shared to the way Diana's dress caught the golden light of the setting sun. The ceremony itself was touching, with personalized vows that spoke of growth, forgiveness, and renewed commitment. Even I felt moved, despite everything that had happened between Diana and me. My father's love for her was genuine, and in that moment, I could see why he had chosen to build a new life with her. But as the evening progressed and more guests used the facilities, I began to notice subtle signs that the plumbing situation was developing exactly as I had expected. A slight odor began to drift from the restroom area, and I saw Patricia frantically making phone calls near the service entrance. The venue staff started looking nervous, whispering among themselves as they tried to manage the growing problem. Just as Diana and my father finished cutting their anniversary cake, the inevitable happened. A terrible smell suddenly filled the air, and guests began looking around in confusion and disgust. Within minutes, dark water started seeping from the restroom drains and spreading across the beautiful stone patio where everyone was standing. The chaos that followed was beyond anything I could have imagined. Guests screamed and rushed toward the parking lot, women lifting their evening gowns to avoid the contaminated water that was now flowing freely across the venue grounds. The elaborate floral arrangements were knocked over in the panic, and the beautiful cake toppled from its table as people fled. Diana stood frozen in the middle of the disaster, my mother's ivory dress now splattered with sewage water, and her face a mask of horror and disbelief. The photographer, to his credit, kept shooting, capturing every moment of what would become the most memorable anniversary celebration of their lives. My father tried to comfort her, but he was equally shocked and disgusted by the turn of events. The venue staff worked frantically to shut off water mains and contain the backup, but the damage was done. 50 guests had witnessed Diana's perfect evening turn into a literal nightmare, and the smell would linger in everyone's memory long after they had changed clothes and gone home. As we drove home in stunned silence, Diana sobbing in the front seat while still wearing the ruined dress, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served in the most poetic way possible, but the victory felt hollow. Revenge had not brought my mother back or healed the wound of losing her dress. Back at the house, Diana immediately went upstairs to shower and change, throwing my mother's dress into the laundry room trash can without ceremony. My father poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sat in his chair trying to process what had gone wrong with their perfect evening. Kyle disappeared into his room, probably to tell his online friends about the crazy disaster his family had just experienced. The next morning, Diana emerged red-eyed and defeated her usual confidence completely shattered. She spent the day fielding phone calls from concerned guests and trying to get refunds from vendors. My father was on the phone with lawyers, threatening to sue the venue for ruining their celebration. It was during one of these heated conversations that I made my casual comment about having heard rumors regarding plumbing problems at the Riverside Gardens. I mentioned it innocently, as if I had just remembered someone mentioning issues there during a work conversation. The look Diana gave me was sharp and knowing. In that moment, she understood exactly what had happened and who was responsible. But what could she say? How could she accuse me of deliberately allowing her to book a problematic venue when she had deliberately destroyed my mother's wedding dress? We were even now locked in a mutual understanding of the damage we had inflicted on each other. Over the following weeks, I found myself reflecting deeply on what had transpired. The initial rush of satisfaction from seeing Diana's humiliation had quickly faded, leaving me with questions about who I was becoming and whether revenge truly served any purpose beyond momentary gratification. I realized that holding on to anger and planning elaborate retribution had consumed months of my emotional energy. While Diana had certainly deserved consequences for her actions, my focus on getting even had prevented me from processing my grief properly and moving forward with my life. The destroyed wedding dress was still gone, and no amount of revenge could bring it back. What I needed was not vindication, but healing, not justice, but peace. I began to understand that carrying my mother's memory forward meant honoring her values of kindness and forgiveness, not perpetuating cycles of hurt and retaliation. 3 weeks after the disastrous vow renewal, I made the decision to move out of my childhood home and find my own apartment. The house that had once been filled with my mother's love had become a battleground, and I needed space to rediscover who I was outside of that conflict. I found a cozy 1-bedroom place in Capitol Hill with hardwood floors and large windows that let in streams of morning sunlight. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely, like I was creating a space that was truly mine rather than defending territory that no longer felt like home. Instead of focusing on preserving physical remnants of my mother, I channeled my energy into honoring her memory through action. I began volunteering at the Cancer Center, where she had received treatment, helping other families navigate the difficult journey we had walked years earlier. Working with patients and their loved ones reminded me of my mother's strength and grace during her illness. I also started a small scholarship fund at my old high school for students who had lost parents, knowing that my mother would have wanted to help young people pursue their dreams despite difficult circumstances. These activities connected me to her spirit in ways that preserving clothing never could. The relationship with Diana and my father remained strained but civil. We exchanged pleasantries during holiday gatherings and family events, but the easy warmth of our early years together was gone forever. Sometimes I wondered if things could have been different if we had found ways to communicate our fears and insecurities, instead of waging war through symbolic destruction. But I also learned to set boundaries that protected my emotional well-being. I stopped trying to win my father's approval or change Diana's behavior, focusing instead on building relationships with people who valued and respected me naturally. This shift in perspective brought a peace I had not experienced since my mother's death. Looking back now, I understand that both Diana and I acted from places of deep insecurity and pain. Her destruction of my mother's dress was likely rooted in her own fears about living up to the memory of a beloved first wife. My revenge, while satisfying in the moment, came from my inability to process grief in healthy ways. The real lesson was not about the importance of getting even, but about learning when to fight and when to walk away. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself and show others that their actions have consequences. But true victory comes from building your own happiness rather than tearing down someone else's. Today, I am engaged to a wonderful man named James, who understands and respects my history. When we marry next spring, I will wear a dress that we choose together, creating new memories rather than trying to recreate old ones. My mother's love lives on in the values she taught me, and the kindness I try to show others, not in fabric and lace. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone destroyed something precious to you? How did you handle it? And do you think revenge ever truly brings the closure we hope for? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life tales about family relationships and finding strength in difficult situations. Share this with someone who might need to hear that sometimes the best revenge is living well. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that healing is always possible even when justice feels impossible to find.